On June 26, 1943, Robert Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt took 21 cannon hits and more than 100 bullet holes, yet it stayed in the air. Flames had swept the cockpit, and hydraulic oil burned his eyes. The canopy was gone. His instruments were dead. But the big fighter refused to die. Johnson nursed it across the English Channel, landed with no brakes or flaps, and rolled to a stop. The ground crew stared in disbelief at the wreck that had carried him home. The story of that legendary flight begins years earlier, in the summer of 1928, in Lawton, Oklahoma. In the summer of 1928, an 8-year-old boy in Lawton, Oklahoma, looked up and saw 3 tiny pursuit planes twisting through the bright sky. Their orange wings flashed in the sun as they plunged earthward in a coordinated dive, then swooped up in a perfect zoom. The child stood transfixed, his fishing trip forgotten, his world forever changed. Those 3 Army pilots, known as the Three Musketeers, performed barrel rolls and loops directly over Fort Sill that morning. Robert S. Johnson did not know it then, but he had just seen his future. In the years that followed, that vision never left him. He spent countless hours with a .22 rifle, learning to lead moving targets by shooting at rabbits and hawks across the Oklahoma fields. He climbed into the boxing ring afraid, but discovered that the first hard punch knocked the fear out of him and left only the will to fight. He played football at 145 pounds, scrapping against men twice his weight. Every one of those boyhood lessons would serve him later, at 30,000 feet over Germany, when a well-aimed burst of machine gun fire meant the difference between life and death. At 12 years old, Johnson finally got his first airplane ride in a Ford trimotor, and the sensation of flight seized him completely. He worked $4 a week at a cabinet shop to pay for flying lessons, and at 14 he soloed a wily post trainer after just 6 hours and 45 minutes of instruction. He landed that little biplane perfectly, taxied back to the hangar, and climbed out with a grin he could not hide. From that moment, he knew exactly what he would become. By 1941, with war already raging across Europe and Asia, Johnson walked into the cadet recruitment office at Fort Sill. He passed a grueling physical examination under a flight surgeon who had already rejected 37 of the 46 men who reported that morning. He signed his enlistment papers on Armistice Day, November 11, 1941, and reported for duty at Kelly Field in Texas. The boy who had watched the Three Musketeers from his father's shoulders was now a soldier, committed to the sky and the fight that awaited him. The news crackled over the radio in the barracks at Kelly Field. It was December 7, 1941, a lazy Sunday afternoon. The cadets had just finished a raffle, and the winner, a boy named Frank Funk, had brought back a radio for the whole building. The music stopped, and the announcer's voice cut through the room like a blade. Japanese planes had bombed Pearl Harbor. Not a man spoke. Robert S. Johnson sat on his bunk, the words sinking into him like cold water. He had enlisted only weeks before, on Armistice Day, full of the dream of flying fighters. Now that dream had a new weight. War was not a distant headline anymore. It was a fact, and he was part of it. Johnson looked around the room at the other silent cadets and knew, without anyone saying a word, that everything had changed. The training that lay ahead was no longer just a path to wings, it was a preparation for survival. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. The weeks that followed were a blur of drill, instruction, and the grinding routine of military life. Johnson pushed through primary training in the Fairchild PT-19, then the Stearman biplane, learning to fly not for pleasure but for precision. His instructor, a quiet man named H.E. Folk, taught him chandelles and lazy eights, slow rolls and spins. Then came Phil Zampini, a precise pilot who wrung every ounce of performance from the trainer and expected the same from his student. In February of 1942, Johnson was still in primary flight training at Sigston, Missouri. On the 21st, his 22nd birthday, he married Barbara Morgan in a quiet ceremony at the parsonage of the Methodist minister in the nearby town of Benton. The couple spent their wedding night in a small hotel in Sigston, and the next morning Barbara left for the bus trip back to Lawton, Oklahoma. Johnson reported to Randolph Field in Texas to begin basic training, leaving his new wife behind. In July, Johnson reported to Bridgeport, Connecticut, assigned to the 61st Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group. The squadron was scheduled to receive the new P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter with 2,000 horsepower and 850 caliber machine guns. Johnson had never seen anything like it. On his first takeoff, the canopy latch slipped, and the heavy plexiglass slammed backward, striking his head. The slipstream roared into the cockpit, but he held the aircraft steady and climbed out. The Thunderbolt was unlike any airplane he had ever flown. It was big, heavy, and powerful, and it demanded respect. During a dive from 35,000 feet, Johnson felt the controls freeze solid in his hands. The fighter was trapped in a wall of compressed air, a phenomenon called compressibility that pilots were only beginning to understand. He could not pull out until the denser air at 12,000 feet grabbed the wings and let him haul the stick back. He landed shaken but alive, learning that the Thunderbolt could be as dangerous as any enemy. On September 16th, a new commander arrived at the 56th Fighter Group. His name was Hubert Zemke, a major who had just returned from a liaison mission to Russia and England. Zemke was a veteran of combat tactics, and he did not waste time. He reshaped the group from the ground up, hammering the pilots into a disciplined, aggressive team. He drilled them in formation, flying, gunnery, and the hard lessons he had learned from watching the Germans fight. Zemke called his outfit the Wolf Pack, and the name stuck. He taught his pilots to stay together, to trust each other, and to fight with overwhelming force. Johnson watched the new commander with respect. Here was a man who knew what he was doing, a leader who would take them into combat and bring as many of them home as possible. By November, the group had received its alert for overseas deployment. The training was done, the Wolfpack was ready to hunt. By January 6, 1943, Robert Johnson and his fellow pilots had boarded the Queen Elizabeth in New York, wedged among 12,000 troops for a 5-day crossing. 5 days later, they arrived at Gourock, Scotland, and were promptly swallowed by the cold English winter. The pilots were eager to fly, but the sky refused to cooperate. Fog and drizzle clamped down over the airfield, grounding every Thunderbolt for weeks on end. When the weather finally broke, the American pilots received a sobering education. The Royal Air Force veterans who had been fighting the Luftwaffe for years pulled no punches. They told the men of the 56th that the P-47 Thunderbolt was too big, too heavy, and too slow to turn with German fighters. A Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf would cut inside a Thunderbolt in any turning fight. The only way to survive, the British pilots insisted, was to stay high, stay fast, and never get into a low-speed dogfight. The Americans listened, but they did not waver in their confidence. Johnson flew his first combat mission on April 17th, a fighter sweep over the Dutch island of Walcheren. The flight was uneventful. The Germans ignored the Thunderbolts entirely, refusing to rise to the bait. Johnson returned to base, frustrated, his guns unfired. He was still a novice, a bomber pilot who had never qualified as a combat flyer. The group sent him to gunnery school, where he barely scraped by with a 4.5% hit rate against a towed sleeve. He had not met the 5% minimum to pass. The official designation of combat pilot still eluded him. On May 19th, Johnson flew as Talon Charlie, the last man in the formation. 2 German fighters appeared high behind the squadron, far back. Johnson dismissed them as too distant to threaten the flight. That was a mistake. They were decoys. 4 more Focke-Wulfs came screaming down out of the sun, their cannon shells flashing white around Johnson's fighter before he even knew he was under attack. He slammed the throttle forward, rolled the Thunderbolt onto its back, and dove for the deck. He did not level out until he had crossed the channel and was alone, heart pounding, the enemy coast fading behind him. On June 12th, the 56th finally drew blood. Johnson and his flight were patrolling near Ostend when he spotted 12 Focke-Wulfs in tight formation below them. He did not wait for an order. He did not wait for his wingman. He called out the bandits on the radio, kicked the rudder, and dove. The Thunderbolt fell through the sky, expanding the lead enemy fighter in his gun sight until it filled the ring. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger, the 850 caliber guns hammered, and the Focke-Wulf came apart in a flower of fire and black smoke. Johnson flashed through the wreckage and zoomed for altitude alone again. Back at Horsham St. Faith, Johnson landed to a far harsher reception than he expected. His flight leader, Gerald W. Johnson and the group commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, were waiting for him. They made it plain that his solo attack had been a violation of the most fundamental rule of fighter discipline. He had abandoned his wingman, left the formation exposed, and risked not only his own life, but the lives of the men he was supposed to protect. Johnson took the chewing out in silence. He knew they were right, but he also knew that he had gotten his first kill, and that the bottle of scotch from General Spots that the other pilots had signed and saved for this moment was now his to open. The experience forced Johnson to face a hard truth. The fighter pilot's instinct to hunt and to kill was essential, but without discipline it was a death warrant. He had felt the exhilaration of the kill and the terror of isolation in the same 10-second burst. He had seen what happened to pilots who chased glory at the expense of teamwork. The Germans were patient, cold, and they always hunted the straggler. On the morning of June 26, Johnson spoke with his friend Ralph A. Johnson about that day's mission. The group had been assigned a maximum effort ramrod to Villacoublay, a target deep in France. The Luftwaffe would be waiting for them. Johnson gave his word. He swore that no matter what happened, he would not leave formation again. If the Germans were going to get him, they would have to shoot him out of his slot. He would stay with Blue Flight all the way through, or he would not come home at all. They crossed the Seine River at 31,000 feet, the sky clear and wide open. Johnson flew the vulnerable Talon Charlie slot in Blue Flight, his head swiveling constantly, scanning for enemy fighters. He spotted them at 6 o'clock, high and closing fast. 16 Fokke Wolfs, wings glinting in the sun, dropped into a diving attack. Johnson keyed his microphone and called out the warning. Once, twice, 3 times. No one reacted. The enemy fighters bore down at full throttle. The first cannon shells hit Johnson's Thunderbolt with a sound like boulders smashing into sheet metal. The canopy dissolved in a shower of plexiglass, hydraulic fluid sprayed into his eyes, and a sheet of flame erupted across the cockpit. The fighter buckled and pitched into a wild spiral. Johnson screamed Mayday into the radio, his own voice unrecognizable. He tried to bail out, but the canopy had jammed, twisted by cannon fire. He was trapped inside a burning airplane. Then, just as suddenly, the fire went out. The smoke cleared enough for Johnson to see that his instruments were smashed and the windscreen was opaque with oil. He could barely open his eyes. The Thunderbolt was still flying, laboring but under control. He eased the nose toward the channel, climbing in short, careful zooms to gain altitude. His face was burning, his hands bleeding, but he was alive. The fighter had taken 21 cannon hits and more than 100 bullet holes, yet it stayed in the air. Somewhere over the coast, a blue Focke-Wulf slid into formation off his wing. The pilot had a yellow nose and a waxed fuselage. Johnson stared across the gap between the two planes. The German studied the wrecked Thunderbolt, shaking his head slowly. He lifted his left hand in a salute, then peeled away, but he did not leave. He dropped back onto Johnson's tail and opened fire with his machine guns. Johnson hunched behind the armor plate, taking the punishment. Again the German pulled alongside, saluted, and flew away for good. Johnson was alone now, half blind, descending over the channel. He called Mayday Control and received a vector toward England. The radio operator kept him on course, correcting left or right as his compass swung. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through a break in the clouds. Johnson laughed out loud. He had never seen anything so beautiful. The controller guided him toward Manston, where the runway was crowded with crippled airplanes returning from the same mission. Johnson called the tower and reported that he had no brakes, no flaps, and no hydraulics. He would have to land wheels down and hope for the best. The gear lowered and locked. He lined up on the grass strip, nursing the throttle, holding the nose just above stalling speed. The Thunderbolt touched down smoothly and rolled up the sloping field. A line of parked Typhoons loomed ahead. Johnson kicked the rudder, slewing the fighter sideways into a gap between 2 British planes. The engine coughed and died. The medical crew rushed him to the hospital. A bullet had nicked his nose. Cannon splinters were embedded in both hands. His eyes were swollen, nearly shut from hydraulic fluid. His flight suit was soaked in oil and blood. The doctors found 2 bullet wounds in his right thigh that Johnson had not even noticed. He refused to lie down until he had walked back to the flight line to see his airplane. The ground crew stood in silence around the wreck. The P-47 would never fly again. 4 pilots from the 56th did not come home that day. Lieutenant Barron, Johnson's element leader, was killed. Captain Eby, Captain Weatherby, and Captain Dyer were also lost. The Wolf Pack had been dealt a brutal blow. Johnson sat on his cot in the Manston sick bay, staring at the wall. He had kept his promise. He had stayed in formation until he was shot out of it. The lesson had been written in fire and cordite. Gerald W. Johnson was shot down on a later mission and became a prisoner of war, surviving the conflict in Stalag Luft. Hubert Zemke was shot down later in the war and held as a prisoner in Stalag Luft, but survived. Phil Zampini and H.E. Folk continued their service as flight instructors and survived the war. Robert S. Johnson recovered from his wounds and returned to combat, flying Thunderbolts over Europe until the end of the war. He finished his tour with 28 confirmed aerial victories, all of them enemy fighters. He returned home to Oklahoma, to Barbara, and to a life far from the sound of cannon shells tearing through aluminum. If you have any stories of family members who served in the air war over Europe, or memories of the men who flew the Thunderbolts, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read everyone. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening.